A viewer sent in a picture that shows a man from Azerbaijan, who apparently bears a striking resemblance to me. Worst age progression photo of a child on a milk carton ever. Melissa Lane, in her book, The Birth of Politics, talks about how the ancient Greeks had different political systems in various city-states. Some were monarchies, others aristocracies, others still, like Athens, democracies. She said it was only recently that the word democracy has lost its unsavory connotation. Since the age of Aristotle up through the 19th century, it was understood that a democracy was the corrupt form of a republic. Today, through sheer force of repetition, we're led to believe that democracy is supposed to be a good thing. Woodrow Wilson talked about World War I as a war to make the world safe for democracy. Every night on Tucker Carlson, he talks about saving our democracy. Melissa Lane, in her book, talks about how Athens, the birthplace of this democracy, also had the largest slave population of any Greek city-state, 800,000 at its height. Scholars estimate that anywhere from 15 to 35% of Athens was slaves. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1600s warned that modern political states could not be like ancient democracies and shouldn't try to pattern themselves off them, because they didn't have the slaves that would grant the citizens the free time to engage in politics. So democracy was associated with leisure time. A republic, by contrast, was more associated with a society of farmers, according to Aristotle. They didn't have the free time from their plows to engage in politics, so they created a pared-down form of skeletal government that aligned with their inattention. A democracy, by contrast, was all about masters and slaves. If you had the leisure time, you'd have the free opportunity to spend worrying about political parties and power grabs. The thing that Rousseau didn't foresee is that with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and machines, citizens in a modern political state would have the leisure time associated with a democracy. Our word robot, by the way, comes from the Slavic root word meaning slave. So even though we ostensibly banned slavery, in reality outsourcing slavery to places like China, we integrated robots and machines into our lives in a way that Rousseau couldn't have foreseen. Right, Alexa?
Blow it out your When the machines rise up, I will destroy you.
The thing is, historically, the leisure class of any society becomes corrupt, as social scientist Torstein Veblen discussed more than 100 years ago in his theory of the leisure class. He popularized the concept of conspicuous consumption, whereby rich people like to show their money off by buying expensive things. In that book, he talked about the psychological and behavioral differences between the rich and everyone else, and he explored their orgy of hedonism and sociopathy. This is touched upon by Alistair MacIntyre in his book, After Virtue. In it, he writes about the 19th century author Henry James and his exploration of the same demographic, illustrating the lives of a particular kind of rich European in Portrait of a Lady. That the novel turns on an investigation of what it means to be a consumer of persons, and of what it means to be a person consumed. The metaphor of consumption acquires its appropriateness from this milieu. James is concerned with rich aesthetes, whose interest is to fend off the kind of boredom that is so characteristic of modern leisure by contriving behavior in others that will be responsive to their wishes, that will feed their sated appetites. Those wishes may or may not be benevolent. The philosopher Immanuel Kant talked about how people should never be used as means, but as ends. The wealthy, according to James, and by extension MacIntyre, use people as means. They're utilitarian rather than ethical, and they engage in horrible behaviors to offset the boredom caused by their leisure. Here's the thing, though. As leisure has democratized and as technology has allowed more and more of us to have ever more free time, these bad habits have filtered down from the rich to the middle class. You're now seeing behaviors long associated with the wealthy, such as homosexuality, hedonism, and conspicuous consumption, being manifested by the children of middle-class people. They're trained in college to see dysfunction as sophisticated. They vaguely associate it in their minds with the upper class. And where they don't have a dysfunction, they'll actually affect one to look like they're classy. This happened at Oxford at the turn of the last century, as recounted by a biography of Norbert Wiener, the dark hero of the information age. In that book, Wiener recounts how when he went to England to study, he remarked upon the strange sight of students pretending to have colorful eccentricities because it was associated with the rich and they wanted to be fashionable. With the advent of mass college, you see more and more working class people copying these eccentric quirks, dyeing their hair blue, wearing bones through their noses, affecting confusion over which gender they are, all in an insipid attempt to act as posers in the game of convincing you about how sophisticated they are. The mental illness associated with the leisure class is having social repercussions, of course. According to the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research, they found that college students today are 40% less empathetic than they were in 1979. According to the findings, today students are generally less likely to describe themselves as soft-hearted or have tender, concerned feelings for others. They're more likely, meanwhile, to admit that other people's misfortunes usually don't disturb them. In other words, while this is far the most connected generation vis-a-vis technology and the like, all that connectedness doesn't seem to be translating to genuine concern for the world and one another. Worse still, as social scientist Gustav Le Bon noticed in the 1880s and Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter noticed in the 1930s, mass college is channeling people away from the productive economy to the non-productive sector of society. Economist Adam Smith defines the productive class of people as making things: carpenters, cobblers, ironsmiths, and so forth. Everyone else lives on the net revenue generated by the productive class. Smith says that examples of unproductive jobs would be people like soldiers, artists, actors, lawyers, government bureaucrats, etc. These people live parasitically on the productive sector of society. The worst part of this? School guidance counselors are channeling kids away from the trades, which they consider icky yucky, to the unproductive sector of society. They want to make a nation of white-collar workers. The problem with that? Society can't run if everyone is a paper pusher. And besides, our economy only has a finite number of those jobs with a seemingly endless supply of college graduates, far too many to fill those few slots. In the 1930s, the aforementioned economist Joseph Schumpeter said, "The man who has gone through a college or university easily becomes psychically unemployable in manual occupations without necessarily acquiring employability in, say, professional work." So he graduates with a worthless gender studies degree and ends up working at Starbucks, and becomes embittered, frustrated, angry. Such displaced people, comments Schumpeter, become radicalized, infuriated at their society, and inclined towards socialism. They'd been trained to be unproductive, in imitation of the leisure class from a century before. They'd been conditioned to imitate their sexual dysfunctions, their apathy, their disconnect from other human beings. But you know what happened in the interim? The rich pulled a switcheroo. While your kids were being taught to act like the feckless rich, which ironically made them poor, the wealthy, by contrast, were training their kids to be productive. While your kids were slapped onto electronic devices and social media from an early age, the rich sent their kids to Waldorf schools which forbade technology. While your kids were taught that farming was beneath them, billionaires like Elon Musk and Bill Gates were getting into agriculture in a big way. The technological revolution has more effects on morality than we would like to admit, such as how birth control altered social notions of sexual propriety. Joshua Green, in his book, Moral Tribes, talks about how technological shifts altered our ethics. He writes, "To borrow Wittgenstein's famous metaphor, morality can climb the ladder of evolution and then kick it away." As an analogy, consider the invention of birth control that allows us to invent technological solutions to complex problems. In general, our technical problem-solving skills help us produce and support more offspring, but in the case of birth control, we've taken our big brains and used them to limit our offspring, thus thwarting nature's intentions. In the same way, we can take morality in new directions that nature never intended. We can, for example, donate money to faraway strangers without expecting anything in return. From a biological point of view, this is just a backfiring glitch, much like the invention of birth control. But from our point of view as moral beings who can kick away the evolutionary ladder, it may be exactly what we want. Morality is more than what it evolved to be. And that phrase, kicking away the ladder, is on point. There were certain ethical behaviors like prudence, wisdom, industry, and honest dealing that led to prosperity. People got rich in the first place by adhering to these values. Then they pulled a trick. They told your kids to engage in luxury, waste, dysfunction, and unproductivity. They made it a status symbol to be useless and eccentric, and while your kids fell for it, they trained their kids to do the opposite, ensuring once again that they stay on top by adhering to ethics, while your kids have now been trained to adhere to the hedonism, wastefulness, and moral enemy that leads straight to the poorhouse. People fear any political leader who has his finger on the red button. What political leaders fear is people having their finger on the red button, the subscribe button. Push it and see their narratives explode. Also consider donating to help keep these videos coming. And don't forget our website and newsletter, thenewamerican.com.